The warmest cabin on the ridge killed them. Not the blizzard outside, not the wolf at the tree line, not the cold that cracked the water barrel before dawn. The thing that killed them was the thing they built to save themselves. 4 log walls, a fire burning hot, and every gap chinked shut against the January wind. They died warm, confused, and quiet, and the settlement wrote it down as weather. That myth, the one that said sealed and warm meant safe, outlived the men it buried by 150 years. And most people building cabins today are still making the same mistake. The myth-named winter of 1842 killed a trapper named Cole. The record has him only as R. Cole, out of the Green River country in what is now Wyoming. His trail partner's journal, recovered by a Hudson's Bay factor in the spring thaw, describes a man who built what the partner called the finest, tightest cabin he had ever sheltered in. Peeled log walls. Moss and clay chinked from floor to rafters. A small iron stove running full bore on green cottonwood, because that was what the country offered, and the snow was already 4 feet on the level. Cole was cheerful at supper. He was confused by midnight. He was dead before the fire went cold. The partner survived because he had stepped outside in the dark and came back to a man who would not wake up. He spent the rest of the night in open snow with 1 blanket. A man survived a Wyoming January outside because the cabin was more dangerous than the blizzard. Let that land. This is not a rare story. Search the fur trade journals, the military expedition records, the homestead diaries from the northern plains between 1820 and 1910, and you will find this pattern repeated like clockwork. Tight cabin, banked fire, green wood, men dead or badly confused by morning, cause listed as exposure or constitution, or in one spectacularly unhelpful Minnesota record, listed simply as the cold got in. The cold did not get in. The cold was the one thing being kept out. What got in was the myth. Tighter meant safer. More fire meant more survival. Seal yourself in and wait it out. A sealed cabin with bad wood and a sleeping man inside is not a shelter. It is a trap with a door handle you are too confused to reach. That is what killed more pioneers than any blizzard ever did. Who was Levi Blackwood? My name is Levi Blackwood, 7th generation on this ridge. My people came out of the Carolinas in the 1790s and never left. My grandfather Eli raised me after my father died in the timber, and before he went, he made me copy everything he knew into a leather journal and swear the old ways would not die with him. This is me keeping that promise. 40 winters running a stone fireplace in a log structure built before the Civil War. I have been cold in that cabin, warm in it, and once, in 2003, dizzy and slow in it. I walked outside into 12-degree air and stood there until my head cleared. I knew because Eli told me. Most people never get told. That is exactly what this is for. The shape of the danger. Here is the science laid out plain. Fire needs oxygen to burn. You need oxygen to think and move and stay alive. A sealed cabin with a fire running in it is 2 systems competing for the same resource, and the fire is better at the competition than you are. When oxygen levels in a closed space drop below roughly 19.5%, a healthy adult starts to feel it. Mild headache. A kind of heaviness behind the eyes. Yawning. A slowness in the thinking that feels. And this is the dangerous part. It feels like warmth. It feels like the comfortable drowsiness of a man who has worked hard and earned his rest. It does not feel like a warning. It feels like exactly what you wanted when you crawled into your blankets. By the time oxygen drops below 17%, judgment goes, coordination goes. The ability to correctly assess that something is wrong goes with them. You know how sometimes you read about a man who drove into a lake and the investigators could not figure out why he did not simply open the window. It is the same mechanism. The organ you use to decide that something is wrong is the first organ compromised when the thing that is wrong is a lack of oxygen. And then there is the carbon monoxide problem on top of that, which is a separate issue and a worse one. Incomplete combustion, which is what you get from green wood or wet wood, or a fire being strangled in a sealed box, produces carbon monoxide. Colorless, odorless, binds to your blood cells with an affinity roughly 250 times stronger than oxygen. Your blood accepts it eagerly. Your body does not sound an alarm. The symptoms, again, feel like warmth and tiredness. By the time a pioneer in 1853 was confused enough to notice something was wrong, he was already too confused to fix it. The mountain men called it bad air. Some of the expedition doctors called it vitiated atmosphere. One remarkable frontier physician out of the Oregon Territory in 1861 wrote in his case notes, "The air in the cabin had been rendered unfit for respiration by the combined action of the fire and the sleeping bodies, a condition I have observed to be more common and more deadly than commonly supposed." He was right. He was about 120 years ahead of the regulatory understanding that eventually made carbon monoxide detectors a building code requirement. And the people dying in cabins between his note and that code are the people this video is about. The ventilation paradox. Here is the thing that will feel wrong when I say it. Stay with me. Cold air coming into your cabin in January was not the enemy. Cold air coming in was the price of staying alive, and the old mountain builders knew it, built for it, and charged it against their fuel budget the same way a man budgets a tool that costs him something but saves him more. The old Appalachian log builders, the ones who knew this ridge country before it had county names, did not chink their cabins from floor to rafters and call it done. They chinked selectively. The upper walls, the gable ends, the spaces near the sleeping loft, yes. But at the floor level, particularly on the side of the cabin away from the prevailing wind, they left deliberate gaps. Not accidents, not laziness. Deliberate. Sometimes they were managed with a wooden plug that could be pulled or seated depending on conditions. Sometimes they were angled cuts in the bottom log that let cold air crawl in low along the floor, while the warmer air above stayed in the room. The physics they were working with, and they understood it by feel and observation rather than by formula, is what engineers today call the stack effect. Hot air rises. It exits high. Fresh air must enter low to replace it. A cabin with a working fireplace and open chimney is already doing this, drawing cold air in through every crack at floor level and sending it heated up the flue. The old builders were not fighting that process. They were managing it. Eli wrote about this in the journal in 1948. A cabin that breathes at the floor is a cabin that lets a man breathe in his sleep. A cabin sealed so tight the fire starves is the one that starves the man in it. Old mountain wisdom. Simple as anything. Costs you more wood to heat it because you are not holding every BTU hostage inside four walls, but you are also not waking up dead, which has always struck me as the better trade. The ventilation paradox is this. The cold gap that felt dangerous was safety. The tight seal that felt safe was the danger. Nobody put that on a sign. There was no money in putting it on a sign. The fireplace was never the problem. Here is something the history books get sideways, and I want to correct it before we go further. Because the open hearth fireplace has taken the blame for a lot of deaths it did not cause. A properly built open masonry fireplace with a working chimney drafting correctly is, from a carbon monoxide and oxygen standpoint, one of the safest heating systems a cabin can have. The open hearth by its nature draws air. It is a hole in the wall connected to a hole in the roof, and it will pull fresh air through a cabin the way a drain pulls water, continuously, constantly, whether you want it to or not. The men who froze to death in front of open fireplaces froze because the fire went out. They did not quietly suffocate. The real villain entered the American frontier cabin in the 1840s and 1850s, and it came with good marketing and a handsome iron body, and it was called the enclosed wood stove. Now, do not get me wrong. I am not here to condemn the cast iron stove. My grandmother cooked on one every morning of her life, and she lived to be 91, sharp as a new axe. But the enclosed stove changed the danger profile of a heated cabin in ways that nobody adequately explained to the people buying them. A proper chimney pulls fresh air through your cabin constantly. An enclosed iron stove with a narrow flue pipe and a damper that could be closed tight is not. It gave the user control over the draft. Control sounds like a good thing, and in terms of fuel efficiency it was. A well-dampered iron stove could heat a cabin on half the wood an open fireplace required. The stove salesman made sure everyone knew that number. What the stove salesman did not emphasize, what did not appear in the almanac advertisements or the hardware catalog copy, was that the same damper control that saved your firewood could also, if closed too tight on a smoldering fire in a sealed cabin, fill that cabin with a gas you could not see or smell while you slept. The iron stove was not evil. It was powerful, and power handed to people who did not understand its failure modes is where the bodies come from. Stove manufacturers in the mid-1800s were not a conspiracy, friend. They were a market, and markets sell the benefit and footnote the risk. Nothing has changed on that front in 150 years. The green wood trap. Second pattern break. And this one is going to bother some people because it sounds simple. Ready? Here it is. Most of the carbon monoxide deaths in frontier cabins were not primarily a ventilation failure. They were a fuel failure first. Green wood. Wet wood. Wood that had not been cut and split and seasoned through at least one dry summer before it went into the fire. The reason this matters is combustion chemistry, and I promise I will keep it short because I am a ridge man, not a professor. Complete combustion, the kind you get from dry seasoned hardwood burning hot in a well-drafted fire, produces primarily carbon dioxide and water vapor. Incomplete combustion, the kind you get from green or wet wood smoldering in a choked or poorly drafted fire, produces carbon monoxide in significant quantities. Green wood does not burn. It smolders. It fights the fire. It hisses and spits and steams, and the fire works harder and harder to drive the moisture out of the wood before it can actually combust. And while it is doing that work, it is running oxygen lean and producing carbon monoxide the way a sick man produces a fever, continuously and without meaning to. The tragedy of R. Cole back in 1842 is right there in the journal entry. Green cottonwood. That detail is not incidental. Cottonwood is already a weak fuel when it is dry. Green cottonwood in an enclosed iron stove in a sealed cabin in January is one of the more efficient ways a man on the frontier could arrange to not wake up in the morning, and he did not know it, because nobody had connected those dots for him in a language he had access to. Eli kept a woodpile that was never less than a full year ahead. He cut it in spring, split it in summer, and stacked it under a shed roof to season through one full cycle of heat before it ever came inside. He said his father had told him that a man who burns green wood in a tight house is borrowing warmth from his own future, and the interest rate will surprise you. I always liked that line. The old man had a way with the sentence. What the mountain builders actually did here is exactly what the survivors actually did differently. 6 habits. Not theories, habits, built into the daily rhythm of a working cabin the way breathing is built into a working body. First, they cut and seasoned their firewood a minimum of 1 year ahead. 2 was preferred, and they stacked it bark side up under cover where air could move through the pile. The wood that went into the fire in January of 1860 was cut in the spring of 1858. That is the standard they held. Second, the chimney was cleaned before the heating season and inspected for blockage after any significant windstorm. A blocked chimney on a sealed cabin is a death sentence served slowly. Creosote buildup from green or softwood fires could restrict the flue to the point where draft failed and gases backed into the room. The old builders ran a bundle of burning straw up the flue in October every year to both clean it and test the draft. Simple, cheap, took 20 minutes, and it told you everything you needed to know before the hard cold set in. Third, the sleeping area was positioned in the cabin with deliberate attention to airflow. Upper loft sleeping was common not only because heat rises, but because the sleeping body in a loft was in the warmest air in the cabin. But the loft also had a small gable vent, or a deliberately loose board at the peak that could be cracked open. Fresh air came in cold at floor level. The chimney pulled it through. The loft vent let the used air out high. The sleeper in the loft was in a continuous, gentle, slow current of air the entire night without ever feeling a draft. Fourth, the fire was never fully sealed overnight. Banked, yes. Dampered down, yes, but never fully closed. Eli had a specific instruction for this written in the journal that I have read so many times I could recite it forward and backward. Damper at 1/3, never shut, never full. The fire breathes, so you breathe. 7 words of instruction that probably kept more people alive than any medicine available on that ridge in the 1930s. Fifth, green wood never went into the overnight fire. Daytime fire, working fire. You could run a piece of green wood alongside dry to stretch the pile if you needed. But the log that went in at bedtime was the driest, densest piece in the shed. Oak, hickory, maple. Dense hardwood seasoned hard and split to the right dimension for a slow, complete, carbon monoxide lean burn through the night. Sixth, habit costs nothing and saves everything else. Before bed, every single night from October to April, one of the old mountain families opened the cabin door for a count of 60. Just 60 seconds. Cold air in, bad air out, door closed, fire banged, sleep. My grandfather called it the nightly clearing. He did it every night of his adult life. He died in his own bed at the age of 87 with his full mind intact. 6 habits. Not one piece of technology required. Not $1 spent. The stove salesman's. War on fresh air. Third pattern break. And here's where the story gets its teeth. The 6 habits I just described were not secret. They were common knowledge on the frontier. They were in the agricultural bulletins, in the household manuals, in the practical instruction passed from one generation to the next, the way a man passes a knife, handle first so nobody gets cut. So why did they disappear? Because in the second half of the 1800s and into the 1900s, the enclosed iron stove and later the coal-burning furnace were being sold not just as heating devices, but as solutions to the discomfort of the old open system. And the primary discomfort being sold against, the thing the advertisements identified as the problem the new stove solved, was drafts. Cold drafts. The chill at floor level. The cold air moving through the cabin that the old mountain builders had put there on purpose. The stove catalogs and the fuel industry literature of the late 1800s ran a sustained, profitable, completely uncoordinated, but remarkably consistent campaign against the idea of a drafty house. Drafts were reframed as waste. Cold air coming in meant warm air going out, which meant fuel cost going up. Seal the house. Stop the waste. Buy the efficiency. That was the message, and it was not wrong in the narrow economic sense it was describing. You do use less fuel in a tighter house. Rewrite into 10 words. Nobody put the other side in the advertisement. Less fuel, less draft, less fresh air, more of everything the fire produces that you do not want to breathe. Nobody put that in the advertisement. There was no dollar in that sentence. By 1920, The cultural understanding of a drafty cabin had shifted from a sign of good mountain sense to a sign of poverty and poor construction. The man who left a gap at his floor on purpose was the man who could not afford to chink it properly. That is how completely the story had been turned around. And the 6 habits went with it, because habits attached to a practice that has been reframed as backward tend to get dropped along with the practice. The symptoms they wrote off as weakness. The Frontier Diaries are full of a syndrome nobody named. Winter sickness, some called it. Cabin fever, though that term got attached later to the psychological effect of confinement and lost the physiological meaning it probably originally held. The symptoms appear again and again in expedition journals and homestead diaries from the 1830s through the early 1900s with a consistency that reads, "If you know what you are looking at," like a clinical description. Morning headache, usually described as behind the eyes or at the temples. Unusual fatigue that did not respond to sleep. A kind of mental fog that the writers described as sluggishness or dullness. Nausea in some cases. In the more severe accounts, confusion and what the writers called wandering of the mind. An 1867 diary from a Minnesota homesteader named Astrid Berglund, and I want you to notice that this woman was a careful and intelligent observer, describes a winter in which her husband and eldest son were, as she puts it, taken by the winter sickness, such that they could not cipher simple sums, nor recall the day of the week. She nursed them with open windows and strong broth, and they recovered. She did not know what she had done that worked. She just knew that open windows and broth seemed to help. And that is exactly right, because the open windows were doing the actual medicine. Frontier doctors who saw these cases had several theories. Miasma from the soil was popular. Weakness of constitution was common. The specific individual was considered to have a susceptibility that stronger men did not share, and this, I want to point out, is how bad air killed the wrong people in the historical record. It killed men who were labeled weak, and the cabin that produced the bad air went right on doing it to the next man who moved in. One military expedition surgeon in the Dakota Territory in 1874 wrote something that should have changed everything if anyone had known what to do with it. He noted that in every severe case of winter sickness he had observed, the quarters had been unusually well sealed, and the fire had been run through the night on whatever fuel was locally available, which in that country was green cottonwood and buffalo chips. He recommended ventilation as a treatment. He was correct, and he was ignored, and the next winter the same post reported the same cases. The one rule that kept them alive: strip everything else away. Forget the 6 habits, forget the chimney science, forget the combustion chemistry. Come all the way down to the bedrock and there is one rule, one sentence, one practice that costs nothing, requires nothing, and separates the families that lost people in winter cabins from the families that did not. Crack before you sleep. That is it. That is the rule in 3 words. Before you bank the fire and pull up the blanket, you open something. A door for 60 seconds. A vent. A deliberately loose board at the gable. Anything. You flush the cabin with one good breath of fresh outside air and then you close it down and sleep. Cold air in, bad air out, close it up, sleep warm. The old mountain families did this without thinking, the same way you check the door before bed. It was not a scientific practice. They could not have explained the oxygen partial pressure mathematics or the carbon monoxide binding mechanism. They just knew that the families who did this slept fine and the families who did not sometimes had trouble in the morning, and that was sufficient evidence for people who were paying close attention to what kept them alive. Eli wrote it as a note at the bottom of his fire management section. Not a headline, not an important instruction. Just a note, like a reminder to a student who should already know. Before sleep, clear the cabin. Door or vent, 60 count, then bank, and sleep. He wrote it as if it were obvious. It was obvious once. Then the sealed house came in with its advertisements about draft and waste and efficiency, And the obvious thing stopped being taught because it ran against the commercial interest of the people who were now selling you heat. The nightly clearing disappeared from household instruction the same way the shepherd's crook and the reflector wall and the char cloth disappeared. Not with a law, not with a ban. With a marketing budget and a generation that did not get told. That generation's grandchildren are watching this video right now, and now they know. What you do with it now. None of this requires you to build a log cabin, or move to a ridge, or give up your forced air furnace, which if you have one, I am sure is very nice, and I bear it no personal ill will. Here is the practical takeaway for the house you already live in. First thing, buy a carbon monoxide detector if you do not own one. Mount it low, near sleeping areas, not near the ceiling where it ends up being decorative. $18, non-negotiable. This is the one piece of technology that does what 60 seconds of open door used to do, continuously, automatically, without you having to remember. Get one this week, not next week, this week. Second, if you have a wood stove or a fireplace, buy a cord of seasoned hardwood and be particular about the word seasoned. Ask when it was cut. Split wood that was cut less than a year ago is not seasoned, regardless of what the man selling it tells you. It is green wood in a pile, which is a different thing from what your great-grandfather burned, and the difference matters in a closed room at night. Third, run your damper at half, not closed, on a banked overnight fire. Full closed on a live coal bed is how the bad outcomes happen. You want the fire breathing. You want the cabin breathing. Half damper, every night, every time. Fourth and last, do the nightly clearing. 60 seconds, door open, before you bank the fire and sleep. It will feel wasteful and cold. Do it anyway. The cold mountain families knew something the warm-sealed families did not, and the record of who survived the winter is where that knowledge lives. 4 practices. 1 costs $18, 3 cost nothing. Josiah Cole did not die of a blizzard. He died of a belief, the belief that tight and sealed and warm was the same thing as safe. It was not. It has never been. And the settlement wrote it as weather because the alternative, the admission that the cabin itself was the killer, was harder to carry. The myth outlived him. It outlived the fur trade and the Homestead Act and the open range and nearly every physical trace of the world he lived in. It is still alive in the way people think about a sealed house and a full fire and a tight building as the definition of winter safety. Now you know the other side of that ledger. The chimney that breathes, the wood that burns clean, the damper at half, the 60-second clearing before sleep, the cold gap at the floor that was never an accident. A man who knows these things cannot be killed by his own cabin. That is a small sovereignty and a real one. Same as the char cloth and the fat wood and the bough bed. It is one more brick in the wall of not needing to be rescued by something you could have understood yourself if somebody had just sat down and told you. This is me telling you. Now tell me in the comments. Did your grandparents do the nightly clearing, or something like it? Did they have a name for it? Different regions called it different things, and the practice that shows up most in the comments is the one I go deep on next. The library is not closed, friend. It was just locked for a while. Keep the old ways. They kept us.